Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz, including either up now as we're recording this or soon to be up. I've had a chance to get a little sneak peek at it. A team-by-team breakdown of this very contest. So after we get done talking about all this here, and certainly all the things that we will discuss here, so much more there on the RotoViz pages as well, where you can get all of Shawn's thoughts about each of the teams. He goes through the teams and the kind of team situation and their paths and those things, and then the individual players as well, and what their matchups look like, what their paths may look like. Incredible piece of content if you're playing this contest. The contest at FFPC is a $200 buy-in where you can win a $500,000 grand prize, or there's a $35 buy-in version, a little bit of a bigger tournament, a little bit lower price point. You can win $100,000. Definitely go check that out at FFPC. I want to run through really quick and give the parameters for the contest. It feels like every piece of content that we do around this contest tries to do this, and it's difficult to do because it is a unique contest, and there's always questions about the actual parameters. And we want to be able to, in our own Stealing Bananas way, dig into the strategy, the unique, elements of the strategy of this contest. But we do want to lay out the parameters for anyone who's new to the contest as well. So if you're new to the contest, I'm going to try to lay this out really quick. Our buddy Pete Overzet over at Ship Chasing, where we've done some content on it this week, pulled that phrase. It's one of these things that takes 10 minutes to learn, but a lifetime to master. And it is that kind of a contest. I can tell you the parameters of it, but I'm also going to 14 teams will be represented in your lineup. 2 teams will be what we call full faded. They will not be used at all. 2 teams will be soft faded, which means you're playing either their kicker or their defense, and there is a kicker and a defense spot. The other lineup spots are a quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 receivers, 1 tight end, and 4 flexes. So you can play up to 6 running backs, you can play up to 6 receivers, you can play up to 5 tight ends. It is a tight end premium site, FFPC, so flexing a tight end is often viable in this format. Because you can only play 1 player for each team, and because the playoffs create some interesting constraints about how many games the different teams play, all of these playoff fantasy football contests have that constraint where you got to think about who's going to actually be able to go on and win the contest and those types of things. You do need to think about the unique puzzle that is created from those constraints. So you have the puzzle from a team-by-team perspective and the puzzle from a position-by-position perspective. There's 2 things that play in here, and that's what is what everyone is going to be playing with as they make their teams, and it's why often a lot of the teams do wind up becoming, or the certain types of builds do wind up becoming a little bit chalky, which means a lot of people are playing them, which is something you do want to try to avoid. So as we get into the strategy, we're going to start to talk about those second and third order strategies of how can we create some leverage on the field and how can we actually win this contest. But in thinking of like some examples of the ways that this may be kind of chalky, I'll just give a quick example that at quarterback, you're likely to see in a lot of the teams, Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson as the quarterback. Why? They're both mobile quarterbacks and they don't have necessarily elite fantasy scoring teammates. And so it works both ways. It's not just that we think that they may have the most quarterback points. It's also that you don't then have to select one of their teammates, or you're not sacrificing something to select them at quarterback or as much as potentially other quarterbacks. For years, I know Travis Kelce didn't have as good of a year, but for years, the big question for the Chiefs has always been Travis Kelce at tight end or Patrick Mahomes at quarterback or Tyreek Hill back in the day when they had him at receiver. You have great options, but you can only play one. And so then you get into these questions of how is it going to work out at the end of the contest in terms of what position was, or what player was necessary for what position from what team. So last year, for example, the Chiefs won the Super Bowl. They played 4 games because they came out of the wild card. Travis Kelce was in the winning lineup. He was the optimal player because he scored so much. He was clearly the best tight end play, which meant that it couldn't be Mahomes. And so actually it was Josh Allen that was sort of the answer, quote unquote, at quarterback, even though he only played 2 games. Point being, you have multiple constraints to think about this from, or angles to think about this from, both the team and the position elements. But yeah, at quarterback, we're probably likely to see a lot of Josh Allen and Lamar. At running back, you may see more Josh Allen at quarterback because you may see more Derrick Henry at running back. You're likely to see a lot of Saquon Barkley as the representative for the Eagles, which means less teams that have A.J. Brown or Devonta Smith or Dallas Goedert or potentially Jalen Hurts if you want to build a team that's playing the Eagles to go very far. Typically, you want your quarterback and your running backs in your build to be the teams that you think are going far because they're going to be accumulating a lot more points in those scenarios. The receivers can also accumulate a ton of points going far, so there's some nuance to that. We'll get to some of the more nuanced points, but as a sort of a rule of thumb, because quarterbacks score a lot of points generally, you do often want your quarterbacks to go very far. That's why last year was a little bit unique in that Josh Allen was the optimal quarterback in only 2 games. The last little note I want to mention before I kick it over to Shawn is the Super Bowl has another unique element. No matter who's playing in the Super Bowl, the most players you can have in the game are 2, 1 from each team, right? Because you only have 1 player from each team. But all the points in the Super Bowl are doubled. And so that's another part of why maybe the quarterback from the Super Bowl is something that you want, because often quarterbacks score a lot of points. If they get a big, if Mahomes goes to the Super Bowl and throws 4 touchdowns, he can certainly be the correct quarterback, even with a bye this year. And so you have these multiple parameters. There's a big lineup. The temptation, I think, for a lot of people is to play really deep and unique players in this contest that maybe aren't necessary. You can still play good players. I just use that Saquon Barkley example to say that if Saquon Barkley is in like 75% of the teams, which he might be, you can play A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith, and they're still leverage plays. It's a little different than like DFS or other contests where you could just play both of 2 teammates together because of that team constraint. Anyway, I'm going to kick it over to you, Shawn. I've talked for long enough. Anything that I missed?
No, I like that way of looking at it. The way that I wanted to sort of frame it for my piece was this idea that you have to merge 2 ideas. One is telling a story, which you explain what that story needs to be and all of the sort of nuance to it. Now, I mean, there's a lot more nuance, obviously, but in terms of trying to get a concise way and yet get into some of the details, what you just said is exactly how people want to think about it. The second part is that you do need to win Wildcard Weekend. And to win Wildcard Weekend, you want to understand who the teams are, what the matchups are. That's a lot of what I've worked through in the piece, because if you understand the games this week, it sets you up to start out with a big score and to simultaneously increase your chances of having the right live teams, and that means live players for you as you go through. Obviously, you need to be competitive, to have every player. You need to not have faded teams from your lineup win, is the right way to say it, not the other way around. And so I think that this contest is so fascinating because there is so much strategy involved, but there's also a lot of football involved. And I think for me, that is when you get the most fun fantasy football, is when those 2 elements come together and create this kind of dynamic where understanding the teams is vitally important, and understanding, both the strategy and then the tactics rounds that out to make it really fun. It's also just a great way to, put yourself in the mix at the appropriate entry level entry fee for you. Just have a little fun thing on the line for you as you watch these games without it being sort of life or death, as it sometimes feels like, even though it's clearly not.
Yeah, and when you talk about winning Wildcard Weekend, I love the way that you frame it that way, because the key thing when I was talking about all the different constraints and all the key thing of 1 player per team that plays into why you say winning Wildcard Weekend is that the fact of the matter on Wildcard Weekend is that 6 of the 14 playoff teams are going to be eliminated this weekend. Almost half of the field gets eliminated right out of the gate. 2 team, and since we only play 1 player from each team, that has a massive effect on the contest, because it locks in those players. They're not going to play any more games. What they did for the entirety of the contest will be locked in on Wildcard Weekend. 2 of the, typically speaking, you would like your fades, your hard fades that I was talking about, to be 2 of those teams. And you'd also probably like your kicker and your defense to come from that group. So in some respects, you'd like to have set up your build. This is like a little bit of advice in terms of like, well, how do I approach this? You said so many things about this contest. How do I approach this? Well, the way to approach it probably is to start. Number one is, as Shawn said, think about telling the story. And then number two, think about Wildcard Weekend. The telling the story thing is going to include sort of who you think's the winners, right? The Super Bowl participants, or at least the conference champions on each side. Who's making a run this year? Those, you're going to want their key players. You're going to want your quarterback and your key players in your build to come from those teams, most likely. And then when you go back to that Wildcard Weekend, what you're thinking about is, I want my fades, I want my kicker and my defense to be these teams that were eliminated and only played one game. Because in all likelihood, a kicker and a defense isn't going to have such a massive score that it's like, oh, I had to have that guy. But then because 6 teams are eliminated, that's only 4 of the teams, the full fades and the soft fades. There are 10 non-kicker or defenses that get into your lineup. That whole starting lineup I said. Quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 receivers, tight end, 4 flexes. That's 10. 2 of those, 2 skill players, plus QB plus skill player, have to be players that were eliminated on Wildcard Weekend at minimum. It could be more if the 1 seeds also get eliminated in their first game. It could wind up being 3 or even 4 teams where a player in your lineup is locked and only played 1 game. What that means is, and why Wildcard Weekend is so important to win, as Shawn was talking about, you want to come out of Wildcard Weekend with the top scoring skill players in like a flex spot that lost in Wildcard Weekend. And the way that a lot of people love to approach this contest, one of the first mistakes and the biggest mistakes I see over the years, is they approach it from a sweat perspective, where they're like, I don't want to have to pick this game. I want to play both sides of it. So whoever wins, I'll have a player going forward. So one of the examples of the games that's going to happen a lot from this year is going to be the Rams and the Vikings, where people are going to want to play Puka Nacua and Justin Jefferson because they don't want to not play those guys. They're going to play both sides of that game. It has the closest spread in the betting market. And so they're like, I don't want to have to pick a winner either. Whoever wins and goes on, I want to know that I have a player live to continue to, if Jefferson has a huge game in the second round, or if Puka has a huge game in the second round, I want to know that I have the ability to get that into my score. One of the things that can happen if you try to do it that way, that's sort of the floor play, is it's a conservative approach, but in a loss, one of those guys could have a decent game, but not be one of the 2 top scoring skill position players eliminated Wildcard Weekend. So Shawn said, making sure to win Wildcard Weekend, you wouldn't be winning Wildcard Weekend if in a loss, Justin Jefferson goes for 15 points and 2 other players that lost on Wildcard Weekend went for 25 plus. Which likely will happen. We'll have some crazy games. So by example, from last year, we had the Packers upset the Cowboys. Dak Prescott ends up throwing 60 times. The guy who actually was the star of that game was Jake Ferguson, had 3 touchdowns. And so he was a player in a loss who had this monster game in tight end premium. And you really wanted to have him in your lineup once you were leaving Wildcard Weekend. That's how you won Wildcard Weekend, was to have Jake Ferguson and really to have predicted that was going to be an upset. So the big thing that we talk about when you say the tell a story is we talk about being willing to pick winners and actually kind of pick a bracket, as opposed to saying, I want to play both sides of the Rams and Vikings, because that's what other people are going to do. If you're willing to pick winners and say, I think the Vikings are going to lose. Okay, you think the Vikings are going to lose? Then you might want to actually consider fading them, because a lot of people aren't going to do that. And it gives you the opportunity to create some leverage in the contest and help your chance to actually win the contest by then going and playing a player that is more likely to lose, so people aren't likely to play him, but can outscore Jefferson in a one-and-done situation on his side. So one team Shawn and I were talking about before was the Broncos, or I'll bring the Steelers into this. They're the 2 biggest underdogs in week 1. People are going to fade those teams pretty heavily because they don't think they can win, and they don't want to bet on – they want to fade teams that they don't think are going to play multiple games. But the constraint, the reality – from the playoff contest is 6 teams are going to play 1 game this weekend. So even if you think those teams are going to lose, the real question is, can George Pickens or can Cortland Sutton or whoever your favorite players from those teams, can they score enough points to be one of the top skill position point scorers among 6 losing teams in the opening weekend? And as we get into the game by game stuff, Shawn, you've done incredible research on this. I've done plenty of talking in the first 15 minutes of this podcast. We're going to need to go to you for some good stuff. And this is a perfect point to do so. You were talking to me prior to the show that you feel like the Broncos are probably, first of all, being disrespected a little bit as a potential, not likely, but plausible upset candidate. And I was telling you, I've been betting on them and stealing lines all year, and I feel like the Vegas lines have not respected them all year. I went and looked it up. They were 12-5 against the spread this year. That includes week 18, where they had a blowout win against the Chiefs backups. But if you want to throw that out, 11-5. They were also 11-6 against the over-under, to the over. And that was something else I was doing over at stealing lines, was often taking the over, because I felt like the lines were typically disrespecting the Broncos offense in particular, because the Broncos defense is known to be pretty strong, but there were certain matchups where it felt like the way to play their offense was through the over. That includes, I said 11-6. That includes an under in that blowout win in week 18. So they were 11-5 in that coming into week 18 as well. Point is, more often than not, the Broncos were mispriced by the spread and mispriced by the total, which you may expect, since we know that coming into the year, a lot of people had the Broncos as a very low win team and they wound up in the playoffs. But it still is interesting that throughout the year, they continued to not necessarily be heavily respected by the lines themselves. They go into this game as significant underdogs. It does have a reasonable game total of about 47 or 47.5. But you were talking to me prior to the game. You think they could, there's some weather concerns, but you think they could go into Buffalo and play a competitive game and maybe play into a shootout. And if they can play into a shootout, there's the possibility that playing a Bronco, even in a loss, especially if they were able to upset, but even in a loss, winds up being a real key, because nobody's really going to want to play the Broncos.
And so you hit on the combination of elements there that make them pretty compelling. They won't be heavily played, and they could be very high scoring, and there's even that possibility for the upset. Ben, you and I talk about how watching the games is helpful for us as we do things like your Stealing Signals column, the Zero RB Universe, and the articles I write for RotoViz. I do feel like just going through all of the games gives me a sense of where these teams are and helps me do things like adjust for schedule that you might not get if you're not doing that. But one of the things I did want to do in preparing for the contest was to look at a lot of the different reality rating systems and make sure that my intuition on the teams, again, beyond just their record and some of the most straightforward things that you see, that intuition was correct, because some of these teams will end up playing very different schedules and that type of thing. In doing that, it does confirm my evaluation, which is that it's not guaranteed, but it is likely that the Broncos are significantly better than teams like the Steelers, the Commanders, the Texans, even the Rams, and then, probably are closer to teams like the Chargers and the Bucks than people may realize. Now, that doesn't mean that sets them up well in a road game against the Buffalo Bills, because the Buffalo Bills are quite a bit better. But when we're thinking about kind of where they rank in this group, that's helpful information to know. Something else that is relevant, I think, when we're talking about how teams are going to score, is that even if you take out that blowout victory over the Kansas City Chiefs, over their last 6 games of the regular season, they scored a lot of points, and they scored a lot of points per drive. Then you dig into some of the peripherals, and you see that their passing offense, their receivers, create a ton of separation. The Bills' passing defense gives up a ton of separation. Bo Nix also deals with very little pressure. You work through these various elements, and it does set up for one of these Bills-Rams or Bills-Lions shootouts where, yes, the Broncos probably lose, but they score a lot of points as they chase in that loss. You go back and look at what the Bills have given up to opposing receivers, and you see a massive game for Puka Nacua over 40. You see Amon-Ra challenge that. You see Patriots receivers, and again, even if you take out the game where they're not really trying at the end, Keyshawn puts up big numbers against them in week 16. Garrett Wilson does fine against them in week 17, even though they kind of hold the Jets down in that one. When you have a lot of different elements that set up nicely for a team in a shootout context, I think you have to look at that and say, I would prefer to have a player. If I think there is a certain player who's going to go off in this game, then I would rather have sort of that optionality of playing both sides of a different game. Now, one of the things I do think is interesting is that when we look at the game level similarity projections, one of the sort of automated tools on the site that looks at basically historical matches on both sides, historical matches for players and historical matches for defenses, and then says, well, this is how those players have scored. These are the range of outcomes, etc. Puka looks so good that I do think you probably want to play both sides of Vikings Rams. But there is a potential there. I think you want to play the Vikings because the Vikings still do look like a power team. They look like a team that's going to go on the road and win, maybe win easily. But Ben, the game that you and I have talked about as we got into sort of hours of discussion leading up to this, Eagles, Packers, a game that features two very good teams. The Packers are actually one of the better teams in the playoffs, even though they are the 7th seed in the NFC. But both quarterbacks are dealing with some injuries. Both defenses are excellent, which is one of the reasons these teams are so good. Is that an environment that provides some additional potential for the right type of pivots? When we think about telling a story, we think about what the rostership levels are going to be in the contest, either for picking an Eagles upset, which in some ways is hard to do because the Eagles have so many fun offensive players, or simply just fully fading a Packers team that has become very reliant on Josh Jacobs.
Yeah, so you hit on 3 key matchups from Wildcard Weekend there. The Broncos and Bills, the Vikings and Rams, and then got to the Packers and Eagles. And basically the reason I wanted to lay everything down, and I did, is that for anyone who's listening is like, well, how do I build a team in this? Some of the questions I'll often get are like, how contrarian do you be in those types of things? And I we definitely want to hit those things. But then Shawn's also answering some really good questions about the smart ways to get contrarian. So there's two different questions there. And as far as how to approach, I talked about the parameters a ton. You can still play the chalky plays, as I'm calling them, the plays that everybody wants to play. And in fact, I would argue, I think you should. You should have some of them in your lineup because we're very unlikely to get a postseason where none of the good players score points. This is a 12-man roster that is going to, it's not stackable like in DFS. DFS is a 9-person roster, and you can play quarterback and receiver stacks that kind of limit the things that you get right. This is pretty uncorrelated. Some of it you can correlate by telling a story with your bracket, as we've been talking about, but the specific ways that the players score points are not correlated. You can't play, Joe Burrow with Jamar Chase in this lineup. That team's not even in the playoffs, but that's something you can do in DFS. You can stack up the Bengals or in best ball or etc. This is not something where you can stack things up. So you don't need to have a leverage play on all 12 of your teams. The 2 biggest mistakes I see are that people go too galaxy brained, as we like to say. They have way too many leverage plays in their lineup, that's number 1, or number 2, they play basically all of the obvious plays and then just basically try to change one player and think that's enough. That's probably more likely to be, that's potentially viable depending, but it's more likely to be sort of the it's matching a lot of players to what a lot of other lineups are going to be. And so it winds up being a very popular build type, which makes it difficult. Not only you may get duped lineups, which people may have the exact same lineup as you, but not only that, it makes it very difficult. You have to get exactly correct potentially for the best way to build the very chalky build. I'm saying this in a weird way, but because it's 12 uncorrelated things. There's a lot of permutations of possible lineups. And because of that, it's not always the optimal lineup that wins. So last year, Jake Ferguson had all these points. He wasn't actually in the winner's lineup because it was hard for the very low number of people who played Jake Ferguson to pair him with all of the other 11 things you had to get right in terms of not just the players from each team, but the way the bracket goes. If you didn't have the right matchup winners in other games, it kind of puts you out where that Ferguson points don't provide enough of a benefit to make up for the fact that you don't have a player from a team that played 2 or 3 or 4 games, went all the way to the Super Bowl. So it's you're trying to parlay 12 things together is really what it comes down to from the way that I like to think about it. And so if I was doing a huge parlay, I wouldn't be picking all long shots. But I also, because you're doing it against other people, can't just pick all of the most obvious plays. I like to think about it as maybe 6 to 8 of the more obvious plays, and then the other 4 to 6 lineup spots are going to be smart or interesting pivots or different. And then those pivots can be within the individual teams or ways of playing the bracket. And you just hit on this really well. Even though a lot of people are going to play the Rams and Vikings, which I said, you noted that you still like to play both of them, as opposed to one option would be to pick a winner in that game and pivot completely off the Vikings, which I mentioned. You mentioned maybe not going that way, but the way to then play that game might be to pivot off of one of the players, pivot off of Jefferson to Jordan Addison, who we love on this show. You're still playing both sides of that game. Or you can do it by picking different games. The Eagles and Packers is going to be a popular one to pick both sides of. It may not be the most popular, but the Packers are widely thought of as being one of the better 7 seeds in the entire contest. If you go look at odds, they have the 4th best odds to win the NFC of the 7 NFC teams, despite being the 7 seed. They have better odds than 3 teams that are ahead of them. That may not be perfectly indicative of how strong they are. And Shawn was just talking about, due to some injuries and due to the way they've been playing lately, the potential for fading them. And so you're getting unique, or your leverage play there is to not play the Packers at all, right? So that you can make room to play, say, somebody from the Broncos, who we were just talking about as it relates to that Broncos-Bills game. So there's multiple ways to pull those few. And again, it's a few. It's not just 1 or 2. It's a few. Maybe it's 4 or 6 levers, those leveraged pivots from the chalkiest plays, the chalkiest builds, which again, the chalkiest build is going to likely be, an Allen or a Lamar. It's going to include a Barkley. It's going to include probably Jahmyr Gibbs as the most chalky Lions piece, which can make even Amon-Ra somewhat unique. Not unique. He's going to be played in a third of the lineups in the contest, but he's not going to be played in more than half, which a lot of these other players that I'm about to mention are. You're going to have probably a lot of Jefferson, a lot of Puka Nacua, a lot of Henry on the Allen lineups, and a lot of probably James Cook as the likely Bills option on the Lamar lineups. A lot of Kelsey. None of the top scoring tight ends actually made the playoffs this year. So Kelsey is pretty meaningfully the top option at tight end in terms of points coming in. And he makes a lot of sense because you want to be able to play a Chief. And it's hard to play Mahomes, who doesn't have the mobility and doesn't have the extra game because of his bye. They don't really have a strong running back presence right now. There's not a lot of clarity at receiver either. So Kelsey winds up being a guy that's going to be pretty chalky in that chalky build. So again, leverage option, maybe don't play Kelsey, maybe pivot to a different tight end and play a different Chief. And so that creates one of those types of pivots. If you're playing Washington, you're going to get Terry McLaurin in a lot of lineups. If you're playing the Chargers, you're going to get Ladd McConkey in a lot of lineups. If you're playing the Texans, you're going to get one of Nico Collins or potentially Joe Mixon in a lot of lineups. And so that's sort of the way that the builds. And then I think the Broncos and the Steelers the chalky part of them will be to not play any of them. They'll be overwhelmingly faded. And so you're trying to find different ways to leverage and build. I like that idea that you just offered in terms of finding different ways of doing that, which is to say that the Packers are a team that I just want to fade. They're a 7 seed. Jordan Love's banged up. Christian Watson's out now. They haven't been throwing the ball well. We talked about this a little bit before the show, and I was saying they really turned it on in the playoffs. They had an awesome game in Dallas to win that game. Then they went to San Fran and almost won in San Fran. You correctly pointed out to me, it wasn't so much turning it on because they were doing really, really well in the second half of last year. Jordan Love was one of the best quarterbacks in the second half of the season last year. His touchdown to interception ratio was the best in the league in the second half of 2023 going into the 2024 playoffs. And so they just kept that going. This year, they really would have to turn it on. They haven't been playing that way, and they've been successful passing the ball, and they haven't been putting up big numbers or anything. And if you think about who you would want to play from the Packers, the first guy that comes to mind is probably Josh Jacobs. He's got a guy that kind of makes sense, but you can probably fade the Packers entirely and say that you're playing the Eagles to win. That won't necessarily be a majorly contrarian pivot, but I do like that idea of just picking the Eagles to move on, because it opens up the possibility. And then if you're fading the Packers entirely, it opens the possibility to play a Steeler or play a Bronco and get a little bit unique on the back end with your fades.
The other thing that becomes a little bit interesting to me when we look at this Eagles-Packers game is that you could fade both teams by virtue of fading the Packers, but then also not selecting Saquon Barkley on the Eagles. We know that Saquon lit up the Packers in week 1. But when we look at the more recent results, and I'm pulling this from the tool that Blair uses for his wrong read articles, the Packers rushing defense is fantastic. As a result, they don't necessarily face a lot of rushing plays. Now, it's going to be different for the Eagles, who have been running the most running plays and doing that very successfully. But Barkley is a guy who has a little bit wider range of outcomes than people might be thinking. And if you believe that would play out in such a way that he's held down by this Packers team, that's a way that you could give them credit, right? Barkley this season finished with an 11.9% evasion rate. That is incredibly bad just in general, but especially for a back who averaged almost 6 yards per carry and 2.9 yards after contact. He was also number 20 in stuff percentage, and because he carried so many times, he actually led the league in total stuffs. Now, again, that doesn't mean that he was necessarily bad. Obviously, he wasn't bad. He was extraordinary. But it does set up for the potential, again, potential, that he would be in a game where he is the defensive focal point. And if you don't break the long runs, that he doesn't have the other high value touches that allow him to get there. Now, again, this really only makes sense as a play if you think the Eagles then are subsequently in danger of going out before, say, making the Super Bowl. And if you think the other options they have, then I'm a huge Devontae Smith fan. I'm always wanting to play Devontae Smith. He had what should have been a 3-touchdown game the other day when he gets clipped at the goal line. He looks utterly unstoppable. One of the things that still jumped out to me as being shocking when you consider that just very recently, when A.J. Brown was asked what the offense needed to do to work on, he said passing. A.J. Brown, according to the SIS numbers, was number 2 in yards per route run. He was number 8 in receiver rating, the rating when he's thrown to. And as good as Devontae Smith was, Brown gapped him again. He drew 8 more targets on, I believe, 31 fewer routes. His ADOT is almost 3 more yards down the field. And again, in terms of what SIS was given, they give him a 0% drop rate for the season. Now, I
told you about mid-season that this was the best.
Is good.
This is the best year he's been having. But Shawn, I'm just amazed he was able to do all that with a piano on his back.
His evasion rate more than double Devontae Smith. The point here is that this game does set up for some interesting permutations that would then carry over into the following week when you add the points together, and that the Eagles do have some other guys. The question, I think, is, what version of Jalen Hurts are we going to get? And, my concern for this game, Ben, would be that you have 2 really good teams, but you don't have the level of scoring that we might expect.
Yeah. And I mean, Again, I think I'm just going to keep letting you break down the games, and I'm going to do the here's what I think is actionable about that. One of the things we talked about or like how to build it into your build. One of the things we talked about on chip chasing earlier this week is if you didn't want to play Barkley and you did want to play potentially AJ Brown or Devonta Smith, even, you are getting off the chalk on the Eagles side, but you're also potentially then you would maybe want to decide to play both sides of the Packers. Maybe you play Josh Jacobs with AJ Brown because then you are giving yourself a little bit of optionality into your lineup where you're kind of free rolling a Packers upset because Jacobs could still be a good enough scorer in a loss if largely because of his massive goal line role. He's scored so many rushing touchdowns. He scored a rushing touchdown in like 8 straight games. He has 3 rushing TD games in the second half of the season in that span in these last 8. So you could have a multi-rushing TD game potentially in a loss if there's some points involved. And so that would be one way to potentially get off Saquon is playing into the receivers, but then saying, well, I mean, one way that Saquon's not correct in this particular contest is if the Eagles do lose in one game and it's the receivers that just outscore him. And so you're for free rolling this idea that the Packers are good enough to win and move on. What you just talked about is, I think, sort of almost a second order play. And I think it's important to think through how contrarian you're getting when you're building. You just talked about playing no Packer and also no Saquon. So you're saying a pretty specific outcome there. You really want the Eagles to win, but you also want them to win in a way that in multiple games, Saquon's not the correct answer. But you also said very intelligently, I want to point out for the listeners, that you're also probably not picking the Eagles all the way to the Super Bowl or anything like that. Because if you play out the scenarios where the Eagles make the Super Bowl or maybe even the NFC Championship, you're talking about Hurts being in the equation for the right quarterback to play, because we were just talking at the beginning about Allen and Lamar and how the big reason those two are going to be chalk is they meet in the second round. And so one of them, these really athletic dual threat quarterbacks, is likely to play 3 games unless one of them's upset in the first round and then the other one is upset in the second round. You're going to get 3 games out of one of those guys minimum before they run into the Chiefs. And then, potentially they could play 4 if the Ravens or the Bills make the Super Bowl. That same thing can happen for Hurts on the other side of the bracket. He could play 3 games or 4 games, and he has that same type of scoring profile at quarterback. So he could be a meaningful answer if the Eagles make the Super Bowl in this contest. The other thing is that dramatically increases the likelihood of Saquon. And this is why I say and I said earlier that when you're thinking about the ways the bracket's going to play out and who's going to go the furthest, who's going to play in the Super Bowl, etc., you do likely want to play their best players because the more games that each team plays, the more it reduces the variance for interesting outcomes. The higher projected player is likely to score more. It's the same thing we talk about when we talk about bad teams limiting possessions to reduce variance. We've talked about this. Use the analogy of like college basketball comes up at March Madness time every year, where the upset teams are often the teams that slow the pace down and shoot well. And then the good teams in college basketball also slow the pace down. And so they reduce the number of possessions, which increases the variance. And if the bad team can just hit a bunch of shots, they can get the upset they need. The teams that play faster and maximize a bunch of the number of possessions, they're more likely over more possessions to show that they're the better team, which we see again in college basketball. We see in football as well. We talked about this last year where the Packers upset the Chiefs in Green Bay before the Packers really became great. They did it by limiting the number of possessions, running the ball, allowing Isaiah Pacheco to run the ball. We talk about this game a lot. We've referenced it this year as well. But a good example of an underdog getting there in a lower possession game, lower total volume, because it increases the variance of the things that can happen in lower total volume. That concept strongly applies to this tournament, this contest, where playing in one game does ratchet up the variance. It can be Jake Ferguson. But if the Cowboys go on and play multiple games, it's hard for Jake Ferguson to outscore CeeDee Lamb last year. He outscored CeeDee Lamb in this contest last year. A good example of that is when Cooper Kupp was at his very best. People wanted to pivot off him in this contest. In the first round, he didn't score the most points for the Rams, but they won. And by the end, when they went all the way to the Super Bowl, Cooper Kupp had a monster playoff contest and was clearly the option for the Rams for this particular contest. So the more games that are played, and especially because you're thinking this team is winning, that's why they're playing more games. They're doing the things that they do well. So if the Eagles play 3 games or 4 games, Saquon Barkley's probably doing some stuff in there and really meaningfully impacting the way that they're moving along, or Hurts is, etc. And so that option
One
that you
little piece
offered,
of kind of into the weeds on it, perhaps, as I'm thinking through what you're saying there, that I do want to throw out is that as we think about the postseason, we want to consider whether these epic fantasy points over expected numbers for guys like Saquon and Henry and Cook are going to continue in an environment where we're now limited to specific matchups and or we're going to be facing good teams and good defenses.
yeah,
And so that's one of the reasons why I think the matchup element of especially Wildcard Weekend, but even then projecting forward to the second week does make a big difference, because so much of the kind of running up the score element that you can get with a one of those 3 backs eviscerating weaker teams may not be in effect in quite the same way that it is during the regular season. So we might not have the same gap between Barkley and AJ Brown, for example, against these teams that we might expect to have, over the course of the regular season. The other thing I was thinking there is that if you are betting against the Eagles, or you're betting against Barkley, but on the Eagles, then it is a question of, do you think the Commanders, well, you might want to pair that. You've been talking about the different things you can do with a Commanders style build, such that the Vikings are sent to the Eagles as opposed to the Vikings and Lions having to deal with each other in that particular game in the second round.
this is one. Yeah, it's a really fascinating thing to then look at the ways that the bracket can pan out. So for people who aren't like immediately familiar with the seeds, this Eagles Packers game we spent a lot of time on is the 2-7 matchup. Well, the NFL reseeds. So if the Eagles win, they move on and they play. They host the winner of the highest seed from the other games, because the Lions would get the lower seed. But if the Packers are able to upset the Eagles, the Packers, because they're the lowest seed, will immediately go to the Lions. The only thing they can possibly do is go to the Lions, which means the Packers' path, if you're like really bullish on the Packers, is to go into Philadelphia and beat Philadelphia, and then go into Detroit and beat Detroit, which are the 2 best teams in the NFC this year. That's not an easy path. They're in a tough spot. But if they do manage to beat Philly, what it causes is it causes the winner of Tampa Bay, Washington, to match up with the winner of Minnesota and the Rams in the other divisional round game, which I don't think a lot of people are thinking of those 4 teams as if they can make Super Bowl runs necessarily. But you're talking about if you mentioned Washington. If Washington upsets Tampa, now all they have to play is the winner of Minnesota, and the Green Bay wins. Now all they have to play is a winner of Minnesota and the Rams, as opposed to if the Eagles do win and Washington upsets Tampa, now Washington goes to Detroit. That's a tougher route, obviously. If Tampa wins against Washington, because they're the 3 seed, in a scenario where Green Bay upsets, now they get to host a second playoff game. That changes where they're playing. As opposed to traveling to Philly in the second round, they could host the winner of Minnesota and the Rams. And so that is a massive difference for the Buccaneers' paths. If they get the Packers to win, if you're a Tampa fan, you want the Packers to win bad. You're talking about we get 2 straight home games and the potential to be heading into the NFC Championship, having only had to really beat Washington and then the winner of Vikings-Rams, which doesn't feel quite as daunting, certainly not as daunting as trying to go into Philly and beat the Eagles. So the paths of the bracket are very interesting, and you can pair your lineup to do that. If you want to make these different types of unique decisions, if you want to fade certain types of teams, you want to think through what that will do to the bracket if this team wins, if that team wins. It's a very fun contest. One of the reasons we do so much work on this contest is there is an edge in this contest, because there will be a lot of lineups that don't think through these things and don't build intelligent lineups necessarily. A lot of weird things can happen too, and you always do want to keep that in mind. I love your note about the points over expected not necessarily still existing in the playoffs. Another sort of similar note that I had thought about it and brought up on ship chasing is the last couple years, we've typically had at least one pretty wild game on Wildcard Weekend, or not every year, but last year that Packers Cowboys game, the Packers came out and started scoring a bunch of points early. So Dak Prescott ended up throwing 60 passes and for over 400 yards, I think it was. Michael Gallup had his only 100-yard game of the whole season, in addition to CeeDee Lamb catching a whole bunch of balls, in addition to Jake Ferguson having 3 touchdowns. It was a game where there was a massive amount of volume because you're one and done. You know for a fact that you just really get after it. A very similar game was played about 4 years ago. The Browns beat the Ben Roethlisberger Steelers, and the Steelers threw a ton. And Juju Smith-Schuster had his biggest game of the year in a come-from-behind scenario. We've had some really unique outcomes in Wildcard Weekend as it relates to this contest, with stuff like the Dolphins a few years ago being a team that nobody wanted to play at all. I think they were playing Skylar Thompson at QB, and yet both their kicker and their defense wound up scoring a ton of points. And we know that those kinds of scoring can be a little bit fluky, but they ended up being a really good team to have put a soft fade option into. So most people really just wanted to full fade them and thought the Dolphins had no chance, but putting a kicker or defense in for the Dolphins was a really unique and positive leverage element that you could build into your contest entry. And so there's a lot of these little elements that, like, yeah, the games can be very unique. They can be different. They can push you in different ways. We should think differently about it. That's why I love your whole write-up that you have over here, but the ones that you've already dropped, I know I've done a lot more talking on this pod so far, but you mentioned, or I think I threw out Addison, but you mentioned Addison, you mentioned Devonta Smith and playing a Bronco. I mean, those are some interesting ways to think about playing the wild card round a little bit differently than the way that the market is playing it. And they are ways that probably give you an opportunity to build some leverage on the field, because those players are not going to be played on a lot of the teams in this contest.
You mentioned the shootout element, and even though Sam Darnold looked so bad against the Lions on Sunday night, and even though the Rams followed up their massive shootout victory against the Bills with a series of field goal fests, I do look at that one and think that that game is going to shoot out. Now, when we think about the recent stats for the Rams passing defense, so much of it is going to be influenced simply by the fact that they got, destroyed by Josh Allen. But you look at a team that faces a lot of passing plays against, that gives up a lot of yards after contact over expected, that doesn't pressure very well. And you think about what Sam Darnold struggles with, and where he could do the whole seeing ghosts thing. I think that, the Vikings, if they're going to make a Super Bowl run, number one, you've got to win this game, but you also have to very quickly reestablish that your quarterback, who coming into the game had a fantastic second half of the season, that he can get the ball to Justin Jefferson, he can get the ball to Addison, he can get the ball to Hawkinson, and that he is good enough to make this season for the Vikings, which was a fantastic season. I think it gets colored so much by just how bad they were on Sunday night. The other thing to keep in mind is the Lions are the best team in football, and it's not particularly close. So losing that one game on the road doesn't necessarily tell you, okay, this team is no longer one of the power teams in the NFC. But I think that it has to be a game like what you talked about with the Packers last season, where you have to come out and make a statement. And then even though the Vikings passing defensive metrics, some of the advanced metrics are pretty decent, you pull up the passing matchup rater, and the PMR thinks that the Rams receivers are just going to run wild against them. And so, again, Matthew Stafford has not been very impressive since that Buffalo game. But if you think about their difficulty, the potential difficulty that they would have in covering a Cooper Kupp, he's got a fantastic PMR. And then you think about what Puka has done, how unstoppable he is. He does have the number 1 rating in the game level similarity projections as well. I'm hoping that this game really is that wild card contest that we look back on a couple of years from now and A, think it was one of the more fun games ever to watch, and then maybe B, launched one of the two teams, well, launched the winner to a run toward the Super Bowl.
I
And the
love
Vikings are the far better team, so they're the more likely team to make that run.
I love that. I think that's an exciting, certainly, interpretation of that game. What do you think about the Commanders and Bucks? Washington's visiting Tampa. That one has the highest over under of the week. The Vikings and Rams is the second highest. So, I mean, it's definitely up there as well. I think those are the two games that people expect to really shoot out. And as you were talking about that game, I was wondering if you were thinking similar with Washington and Tampa, or if you think it might be a little bit different.
Part of it is that the Commanders are probably not very good, even though for a playoff team, even though they were able to get that big win recently against the Eagles, even though Jaden Daniels has been absolutely extraordinary. I've really been trying to build scenarios in my head where they could go on a run and Daniels would be the guy. I mean, you talked about how last year Josh Allen, even in just 2 games, was the QB. I think that Daniels is pretty clearly the guy who could do it in 2 games this year, even though, again, you have to fend off more
Right.
hybrid QBs. You've got to fend off those guys on the AFC side, which is tricky. I mean, certainly it's going to be something where you would play Jaden Daniels with a Chiefs thesis.
Every year's a unique puzzle. One of the things about last year was Lamar had the 1 seed. And so a little bit different. Lamar and Allen both didn't play 3 games. Jalen Hurts, I believe, had the 1 seed as well, but this year also has the potential to play 3 games. So I don't think we'll see the 2-game QB thing this year because you just mentioned it. It's a different puzzle where there's so many dual threat QBs that are also in good seed spots where they could potentially play the 3. If they win in the first round, they're going to host a game in the second round. That's not necessarily true for Lamar because he might go at Allen. But if Allen and Lamar play in the second game, you're talking about one of them getting 3 games for sure. And then likely being the answer over the other one. And Hurts has the potential to win and then host again and fairly easily play 3 games, even if the Eagles don't have a great run or anything. But Daniels is one that I want to tell myself too has a shot. I mean, I think Washington maybe has a shot to make a 3-game run, right? I mean, if they can go in Tampa and win, be strongly helped by the Packers potentially upsetting the Eagles. But man, they're a good team. They took the Eagles to the brink. Didn't they beat them? I can't remember how that game ended.
Yeah, I mean, this is a weird one because the stats on these teams are kind of all over the place. One of the things that we look at in Blair's Wrong Read article is sort of this most recent chunk of 6 to 8 games. And in their last 7 games, the Bucks are 6-1. And their defensive numbers in those games look very good and make it look like not a great matchup for the Commanders. You also have a situation where, I mean, you probably would prefer just to do a full fade as opposed to playing someone like Brian Robinson, who's ice cold. The PMR really doesn't like Terry McLaurin for this game. And I think there are ways where the game shoots out and McLaurin still doesn't score a lot of points, and that you would have preferred to just fade them, even if it's a shootout. I was mentioning to you that Zacchaeus has a great rating. And so if you wanted to get pretty crazy and play a very chalky lineup and do that sort of one pivot thing that you weren't, that excited about early in the show, I think you could do that with him. It's just so tough because so much of what Washington does flows through Daniels, and Daniels probably isn't the right play for this contest.
Yeah, it is. That's a tricky part of the puzzle for this particular contest for a bunch of the different teams. And it's an important thing for people to think about with these mobile quarterbacks because they take up, it's something we talk about in the offseason as far as whether we draft the players on these offenses, but they take up so much of the offense on the plays where the ball doesn't even leave their hand because they're mobile and they scramble and those types of things. It's just a range of outcomes thing. In a Chiefs loss, Patrick Mahomes is going to complete a lot of passes. It's a PPR site with tight end premium. Like there's going to be a lot of completions. You can have losses, even with a lot of points, as you're saying, where Jaden Daniels scores a lot of the points. He rushes for a couple of touchdowns and those types of things. no one else has a massive game. Now, Daniels is a good passer, and Lamar is a good passer. And so there's some scenarios where all these guys have enough completions going around as well. But that's, I think, really the big stat to think about as far as the PPR points and how it impacts the skill players, both the downfield weapons and whether the running backs are able to catch passes. Yeah. So the Commanders Bucks is a really interesting one. The Vikings Rams. We talked a little obviously about the Packers Eagles. That's all of the NFC side. We haven't talked as much about the AFC because the thing that the field's going to do a lot this year is because if you look at the spreads, Eagles are now up to 4.5 points, but every game is inside of that 4.5 point number, other than Bills Broncos and Ravens Steelers, which are both 8.5 or bigger, much bigger spreads. Broncos and Steelers are anticipated to basically not be competitive enough to win. But that's why we'd start at the top by mentioning that doesn't mean you have to full fade them if they have the potential in a loss, because we know that 6 teams are going to lose this first weekend in a loss to have a player who scores enough points that is one of the top scoring players of all the teams eliminated. And you do know that going in, that there are going to be all these teams eliminated. But people are going to want to play both sides of some of those NFC contests that we talked about. They're not necessarily going to want to go over to the AFC side for those 2 games or for the game we haven't mentioned yet, which is Chargers-Texans, which is the one that gets forgotten about a little bit. It's got one of the lowest game totals. It's got the lowest of Wildcard Weekend. I got feedback, Sean, that I call it over-under, and they want me to call it totals because that's the right way to say it. But I always call it over-under because I know a lot of people don't know all the terminology necessarily, but 42.5 is the game total here. Chargers at Texans. Chargers are favored at Houston. You talked a little bit about in your write-up about ways to play this, potentially fading Houston because they are meaningful underdogs at home. This is the biggest road favorite spot. The only other road favorite spot is the Vikings are slight favorites over the Rams. This one's close to a full field goal. It's 2.5 where I'm looking at right now, but I think it's been 3 for most of the week. To the Chargers, they're favored. What do you think about that game? Is that a game that you think you can play both sides of? One of the things we haven't necessarily talked about when you're building your lineups is you do probably want to make sure you play a player from every game because you're kind of picking that player's team to win. Sometimes people will make a mistake. I think it's a mistake in their lineup to either play the kicker or defense or not play anyone at all on both sides of a first round game. Because what you're doing is you're locking in that your lineup is not going to have whichever skill player is highest scoring from the team that wins that game and gets to play 2 games. You want to have guys that play 2 games and potentially put up a lot of points. Having said that, last year, the Texans won and played 2 games, and I believe it was a kicker wound up being the optimal. There's been situations before where a kicker or a defense becomes optimal in multiple games. It's not impossible. If that happens this year, I'm going to guess it comes out of this game, this Chargers and Texans game. What do you think about this matchup? Are there particular players that we should be looking at and excited to play?
Well, one of the things that is interesting here is that you're not going to have to worry about the weather, which is a concern in the other AFC games. And I do think that when we are looking at the totals for the AFC sort of globally, that we want to keep in mind that, yes, these teams are very dynamic on offense. Maybe the Chiefs will be more dynamic on offense going forward. From a fan's perspective, I hope that we see plenty of dynamism, but you do have a potentially elite Kansas City Chiefs defense, almost certainly elite. I mean, the Ravens have turned around the issues they did have on defense, and now they just look like a defensive juggernaut, in addition to having Lamar Jackson and company. And then probably most of these key games when we get into the second round and then the AFC Championship are going to be played in what could be freezing cold temperatures. You could have storms on top of it. We've been sort of almost snowed in here in Kansas City for about a week from the last storm. It's unfortunate, I think, that you're dealing with some of those things in the playoffs, because I would just like to see the players go out without having to worry about that. And if it's a shootout, it's a shootout. If the defenses are dominant, the defenses dominate, but without help from the conditions. Even with that being the case, when we talk about this first round here, where it's not going to be an issue, the Texans have just been so bad. One of the things that's weird about the Chargers, they are, according to almost everything you look at, very heavily favored in this game. Their defensive metrics are still pretty so-so. And so you look at it and you're like, I mean, Nico Collins or Joe Mixon could certainly be good. The Joe Mixon thing is interesting because his peripherals, despite what he did for most of the season, are just absolutely terrible. And then he's been cold recently as teams have finally kind of gotten to the point where they're like, it's not just that the passing offense is not a juggernaut, but CJ Stroud is playing so poorly that all we have to worry about is what they're doing with Joe Mixon. Well, Joe Mixon is not the kind of guy who's going to thrive in that environment, right? So then he doesn't project well, but at the same time, Nico Collins doesn't project particularly well. Certainly you could play him, but he doesn't project particularly well by GLSP. He doesn't have a great passing matchup rating, which if you're saying, okay, well, the Chargers defense is mediocre, you'd love to see that number be better. The other little thing here is off of that monster week 18 game, you would be tempted to pivot to Quentin Johnston if you're going to play chalky lineups. But in this particular matchup, Ladd McConkey's PMR is just so dramatically better that I do think that it's probably, I mean, it may work, right? You can't ignore what Johnston did and the fact that he's also a touchdown threat in these games as we think back, throughout the season. But you're probably giving too much away. And as you've sort of pointed out throughout the show, probably giving it away needlessly if you come off of McConkey, who just has an extraordinary GLSP projection as well, ahead of most of the stars.
Yeah, that point you're saying about giving it away needlessly just refers back to the ideas of ownership and how much these players are going to be played, and how crazy of a play do you have to get get unique, and that's a big part of it. It's different for every team. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is, our buddy Pat Crane does the ownership projections for this contest, and he has Zach Ertz as the second highest projected tight end, because they're a team that we just talked through is difficult to play other than Jaden Daniels or potentially Terry McLaurin. But if you're not going to play McLaurin, where are you going? And you need to fill tight end. And I talked earlier about how tight end's a tough position to fill. So if you want to get off Kelsey, who's the chalky one, Ertz just makes a little bit of sense to help you figure out that Washington game that has the high game total that we talked about. In this game, you have a little bit of a similar effect where there's not really a clear element of, okay, who's the first guy that we should play and who's the second guy. But that you don't, in some cases, it's just literally the second best player on the team is going to be very low played. And that's probably going to be the case for the Chargers. There's going to be a lot of McConkey, and then Dobbins probably going to get like 10% of the field. It's probably going to play some Dobbins. Texans, you're going to get Nico and some Mixon, and then probably no one else. And so if you did want to get unique in this game, you could get unique quick is sort of the point. And similar to the Ertz. Well, not similar to the Ertz point. He's not going to be super unique, but the same idea that it doesn't take going to the fourth or fifth player in an offense to find something that nobody's going to really be playing a lot of. But yeah, this game is a tricky one. And yet one of these players is going to win and move forward. And I kind of like your point. I kind of like just saying, look, I mean, it's probably going to be the Chargers are the better team. And you probably just want to play McConkey, and just move forward. That does require fading Nico and Mixon at very reasonable ownership. I think both those guys are going to be, they're not going to be super, super chalky because people are pretty out on the Texans. And again, you got to find four teams that you're basically playing to not be competitive and advance. And so you either have not advance. And so you either have them full faded or soft faded with a kicker or a D. And so the Texans, I think, are going to fall into those 4 teams for a lot of people, along with, again, the Broncos, Steelers. Maybe the Packers will be the 4th team that's very frequently faded. Maybe the Commanders will be because of the Daniels effect and how that pans out. It's such a fun contest, Shawn. I love talking to you about it because you have some really interesting thoughts about the matchups and the ways to play it. I just want to reiterate to anyone listening to make sure you go read Shawn's whole write-up. I didn't give him an opportunity to break down all of the games in a meaningful way on this show because I was spending a lot of time with the actual contest structure and those things. But he has everything written up from the team perspective, the player perspective, and then obviously the positional implications. I've had a chance to look at the piece. It's fantastic. Very much worth your time. Go check that out at RotoViz. And again, when you're building these teams, try to do it thoughtfully. Tell a story like Shawn said. Make sure you're thinking about ways you can win Wildcard Weekend. And then also how you're going to be set up in the back end to have those 2 highest scoring players in the Super Bowl when the points are double, right? When you get all the way to the championship, you have the player that's the highest scorer on each side. That's really going to be that player you got to have. Which is why we were focusing on, if Allen or Lamar gets to the Super Bowl, they're going to be the quarterback probably. If the Eagles get there, Saquon's probably going to be in the lineup. We didn't talk a ton about the Lions, but Jahmyr Gibbs probably going to be the pretty chalky play there. Amon-Ra still going to be popular, but an interesting play as well. Because the Lions are so good, I find it hard to get a little bit further off of them, deeper into their roster. Because I do expect him to play multiple games, and so it's harder for me to see Jameson Williams or Laporta outscoring in a meaningful way, even with the tight end constraint for Laporta, what Gibbs or Amon-Ra would do over multiple games, that variance element. Chiefs, we didn't talk about a ton either, Shawn, but Xavier Worthy, a guy we both like and are certainly willing to pivot to if you want to get off of Kelsey. But in a lot of cases, it's probably just going to be Kelsey who's the right tight end play, especially if they play 2 games. It's not Mahomes at that point, but they do get 1 win and they get a couple games in. It's just, Kelsey's probably going to catch some passes and do some stuff and probably be the tight end that matters there. Any other parting thoughts?
I feel like I've got to put you on the spot here. Talking about the double points for the Super Bowl. Who do you have in that game? Who's going to be the champion this year?
Oh man, I haven't thought a ton about it. It's obviously very hard to pick against the Chiefs, but it's also not fun to pick the Chiefs because they're boring. Last year we were picking the Chiefs, Shawn, when nobody wanted to pick them last year. So I don't think you can put me in the classification of people who got lulled to sleep by the Chiefs' poor regular season, because we talked about it a lot last year that they were going to turn it on. They did. I think it's a little tougher this year because of personnel. They are getting healthier. They are getting better. I kind of feel like they're going to have a tough, I don't know. The Chiefs are the easy pick because they play the winner of the Chargers Houston. We just talked about that game and not really being interested, unless one of the Bills or Ravens gets upset, in which case they get an even easier matchup because of the reseeding element. So then they get either the Broncos or the Steelers, whoever won. It just gets easy for them, basically. If you pick the Bills or the Ravens, you have to pick them to win against the other of those 2 teams and then go into Arrowhead and win. But I do think the winner of Bills Ravens is going to have a real chance to go into Arrowhead this year and win that game. At the same time, I think the Chiefs have a chance to win. So what is my pick? The Chiefs are the easy pick. If I could take the combination of Bills Ravens, maybe I would take that. It feels like the Ravens year to me, Shawn. We talked about the MVP thing last week. Last show, you got me a little bit more into the Lamar element, and then just seeing the numbers on the Ravens defense, how much better they were in the second half of the year. They became the number 1 pass defense in the league after being like 28th for the first 10 or 11 weeks. The final 6 or 7 weeks, they were number 1 in the NFL. That defense is playing at that level. This might be the year. That Todd Monken offense that got Lamar passing a little bit better. They've had their playoff issues, but a lot of times because they were so dependent on the run and couldn't pass the ball the way they can this year. Be interesting if Zay Flowers can't get back and get healthy. I'm hoping that Flowers will be healthy by the second round. He's out for the first game. I think I'll take the Ravens against the Lions.
I think those are the two best teams. I am a little bit worried about injuries. We saw the Lions look so good on defense against the Vikings. Is that going to be the case in the postseason? If they were a little bit healthier, I would just say the Lions are far and away the best team. So they have the best chance to win it. I mean, it's still just a chance, but you'd have to love them. It's interesting when you think of the two best teams that the Lions probably have the tougher draw than the Eagles in the divisional round, which does complicate matters a little when you're to play a good Vikings team, even if you just humiliated them, maybe especially if you just humiliated them. And then you're going to play a good Eagles team. Again, probably you look at the problem for the Ravens, who again, I just do think are the other best team. You got to win 2 road games. I mean, we saw the Chiefs move through the playoffs as the best team last year, even though they've been poor in the regular season. You can do it, right? But when you're talking about beating both Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes on the road in the cold, when you struggled in the playoffs, when your coaching staff has maybe struggled in the playoffs, that's tough. And I do think the Zay Flowers thing creates potential problems for them. At a certain point, they end up pretty thin in that passing game when, as you mentioned, the evolution of the passing for them and how explosive they are does matter. So I have to pick Lions Chiefs. I'm not going to pick against my hometown team as they go for the three-peat. I don't think they were the best team during the regular season. That's not controversial. I do think they're ready to play. And you look at some of the decisions they've made tactically on offense over the course of the season. You look at where Worthy is now. You look at having Hollywood Brown finally back. I'm just like any other great player. Patrick Mahomes doesn't want to go through a whole season where he's like, I'm the greatest quarterback to ever play in the NFL. And people have been just lambasting our offense the entire season. It's not just that you want to win, but you're like, I'm tired of that. We're going to go score some points. So
there's definitely
it's going to be fantastic.
There's definitely some room for the Chiefs to just come out. You've said this to me before, but to come out and just have a big offensive postseason, which, I mean, they kind of turned it on last year. And I think we're all kind of just like, well, I've talked about it on the show for 2 years now, going back to the Super Bowl the year prior, where they pulled out that motion return play where they save stuff for the postseason. That's something that we've talked about as it relates to fantasy football in the regular season. You can't really expect the Chiefs to want to put up the 5,050 season anymore because they seem to want to save stuff for the postseason in a way that a lot of these other teams, they're trying to prove something to themselves, like the Lions. The Lions are that team. They had to prove something to themselves all regular season this year. Might it fall apart in the postseason? I don't know. I think they're built a little different and they're going to be able to continue it on. The Chiefs they know how to turn it on, man. They're going to have some good moments. It's still going to be tough to get through the Ravens, especially, I think, if the Ravens get there, or the Bills. The AFC is going to be so fun this year.
I think the Chiefs wanted to prove something during the season and failed. So True. Now we'll see if they have the pieces, if they can flip the switch, even for the greatest. I mean,
it was a different year this year in that regard. You're right. They went out and made a lot of acquisitions in the passing game, and they wanted to prove something a little different this year. And then those guys got hurt, and it was hard. And Hollywood Brown's back, but they don't got Rashee Rice. They're not as healthy. Xavier Worthy wasn't quite as exciting as we wanted him to be all year with some of those deep stuff, especially. He's been able to do a lot underneath these last couple of weeks, which has been really nice. Kelsey last year he had a bad second half, but he had a good first half, and he looked like Travis Kelce during the season at times. This year he hasn't really even looked like Travis Kelce for most of the year. He looks like an old man on the field. So it'll be fascinating to see if he can turn it on again for a big postseason run like he did last year. I'm not discounting that possibility, but I think his regular season this year was worse than last year, and it's something to keep in mind. As far as how he looked, he had a lot of catches, but
once they got those guys hurt, they're like, we'll just run the ball if that's what the defense is going to give us. Ben, they've more or less stopped running the ball. That makes all the difference.
It does.
You give
It'll be.
Patrick Mahomes a few more. They're going to go out and score. It's going to be fantastic. We wish
They're not
everybody.
going to roll over at home in the AFC Championship, assuming they get there. I know a lot of Chargers fans are listening, going, "Well, I think Chargers have like 6 fans," but I think those fans are listening and they're going, "If Jim Harbaugh is going to win this game in Houston, and then he's going to go into Kansas City and win that game," I'm skeptical of that. I'm already kind of penciling in the Chiefs hosting the AFC Championship, but that's the game that I'm circling. I want to see Buffalo or Baltimore come in and play Mahomes in the AFC Championship. That's going to be a fun game.
Yeah, I mean, you think about Joe Burrow being the guy who actually did get through them, and where we are now, you definitely have Chargers fans, but also the Chargers team, where they're like, you guys can talk about how exciting Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen are all you want. At some point, you're going to realize that Justin Herbert is actually the best of those quarterbacks, and he's going to be the guy to pull the upset and to pull the team through. The Chargers will be the next team in there. They've been hot.
It's not out of the question. Herbert is a really good player. I don't disagree with that at all. And for anyone who's like, why are you circling the AFC Championship when you got the Bills Ravens the week before? I just think it's going to be so fun. The Bills Ravens game is massive too, and now you got me excited for Chiefs Chargers if we get that one. But if Chiefs do host the AFC Championship, you're talking about the team that wins out of Bills Ravens will be coming in having beat arguably the best other team in the AFC and feeling so confident as they go into KC to beat obviously the other team that would arguably be the best other team in the AFC, but on a high, right? With a type of confidence and swagger that can the Chiefs just stop a rolling Ravens or a rolling Bills again?
But you know who the most like arrogant and fired up team in that situation is going to be? I mean, it's going to be Kansas City against the world and at home. So, yeah, I mean, so many narratives.
The Chiefs are going to be ready for that game. No, I definitely don't believe they won't be. That's why I'm circling that game. That would be a really, really fun one.
I mean, it's going to be one of the biggest games in NFL history, and then the Lions are going to slaughter the people.
You got the Lions winning it all. I think when I said Ravens-Lions, I was picturing the Ravens winning it. But you got the Lions as the best team in football still, with the defensive injuries.
We'll see what they can do. We know they're going to go for it if they hit on those plays. They're going to be very, very good. Ben, that'll do it for a really fun FFPC Playoff Challenge version of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. Make sure you are following him over there on Yards Per Gretch on Blue Sky under his name as he makes that little tweak over there. Stealing Signals, Stealing Lines, Stealing Signals YouTube. Love to have you guys over at RotoViz. Mention the article I have coming out. Blair Andrews has just released a fantastic article working through projections and scenarios and how to make those work for you. Then you guys are doing a full week's worth of content over at Ship Chasing. I know so many of our listeners are listening with bated breath for every word of those shows. Good luck to everybody this weekend. Enjoy the football. We'll talk to you guys soon.